Hey, what's up?
Not too much, not too much. Just starting the day as usual, and starting it, with, flying colors, dare I say. I guess art joke since you're a pixel artist.
Thanks. I appreciate that.
Um, but yeah, man, like, your second appearance, on the platform, the Whizpill platform, I think, your appearance, not to flatter you too much, has been very formative in the direction of, what Whispill would eventually take form into, So I'm very grateful for your influence personally, for allowing me to, cover your story and really get into the nitty gritty of, the technical side of the AI debate and all that stuff, because it's gotten me quite a lot of attention recently.
Oh, cool. That's awesome to hear. I mean, I'm just glad to, have someone who's interested in talking about it, honestly.
Right. Like it can be difficult to find, quote unquote, your crowd, right? I feel like it's one of these things, unfortunately, that you either get it or you don't. Um, and for me, beyond, the hobbyist interests, I'm personally invested in seeing, the cultural impact of, these tools, and what that means, because I've seen VR and I've seen it proposed as this new way to do art and what have you. But I feel like not a lot of people understand the actual ramifications. And for you, you happen to be part of the pioneers, dare I say, of kickstarting a whole new movement, and hate it or love it, it's here to stay.
Yeah, I certainly hope so.
So yeah, man. Catching up in terms of what you've been up to, since last time you've spoken about the tool you've created, and the impact it had on your life. What can you tell us about, what how things are going now, and what things you've done since in terms of add on to the tool?
I mean, things just keep going further and further, honestly. I mean, it's gone from I started it kind of expecting like, oh, this will be a cool little tool. People, might pick it up, enjoy it, that kind of thing. But it's really kind of starting to find its own place as the next big thing for pixel art. I hope it's it inspired me to start some even bigger projects. Working on kind of figuring out what I'm going to do with making like my own pixel art editor, even projects like that. As far as updates to the tool, I've added a couple different models for different tasks. I've improved the main model a ton, added new features for like user interface, made it faster, whole bunch of stuff. A lot of user suggestions, which I mean, that's been super cool in and of itself. Just, seeing a community being built up around this tool. I think we've got almost 300 people in the Discord server now, which is just mind blowing to me, honestly.
By the way, you're more than welcome to plug, the Discord and the comments, for future reference, and I'll add everything up in the pages once it's put up.
Awesome. I'll try and remember to do that.
Yep. So I remember specifically talking about a Sprite, as in the platform, and how they had the pretty less than stellar response in my humble opinion. Not because they were being pressured by a fan base that can be pretty vocal about things even if they're wrong sometimes, but mostly because they essentially took a very they try as best as they could to take a really neutral stance, by not really going after you per se, but not necessarily also disproving some of the fabrication that I've made about you. And my question to you is, since then, has any other platforms similar to what Sprite does either caught wind of what you were up to? Have they reached out to you? Have they proposed, some integration of some kind of your software into their UI? And like, what's up?
No, beyond Ace Sprite, there hasn't been much like industry reaction to my tool at all. There's a couple different developers making their own little tools, like one tool called Pixel Over, which is this really incredible like sprite work tool for animating and creating like pixel art special effects. I've been talking with the developer of that recently, kind of throwing ideas back and forth. But I mean, other than, Asprite, there's been no big name players, I suppose, who've really interacted with me.
Interesting. Well, I guess it is the nature of, the AI space in general, where there's so much going on in terms of competing for airwave. More than likely, you're not going to get much attention, which you've also said that that's not exactly what you're looking for and not even what you've done this whole thing for to begin with. So I'm sure that doesn't bother you.
Yeah,
Um,
man, I'm just fine growing at the pace I am right now.
well, I mean, considering that, even from a monetary perspective, like the tool actually supports you now. So I think that alone, will more than cope for the lack of attention it may or may not get you, which in my opinion is pretty neat. And I had the opportunity myself to speak about some of the things I've discovered and, on this platform here in a live setting with fellow, entrepreneurs and creators. And I gotta say, all of them by and large were shocked at the quality of, what you've done. Could you perhaps elaborate a little bit in terms of, the process of what that entails from, the kind of setup required to run the software to, the rendering process and how much of post processing, if you will, for lack of a better term, do you engage in by the time we see the actual post on your Twitter timeline or whichever other profiles you happen to be posting these things from?
So, I mean, as far as computer setup goes, I started with a 3060, 12 gigabytes VRAM. I think I had a Ryzen 5800X CPU. So a pretty powerful computer. I've since moved to a 3090, which is a lot easier for developing and building these tools. Um, yeah, so that's kind of my hardware as far as getting stuff generated goes. The image creation pipeline is pretty much, I just think up, all right, what do I want to see here? What would be a neat image to show off to people that can kind of demonstrate some of uh, the skills, I guess I'll call it, this strong points of retro diffusion. So, I think maybe some, like in my recent tweet, like some mushrooms, right? Because those are pretty cool. Pixel art mushrooms are always pretty aesthetically pleasing. Some nature stuff like panda, fox, that kind of stuff. And I really just make some simple prompts like a portrait of a fox sitting in a field. Nothing crazy. I try to avoid all that craziness. So from there, it gets passed off to the retro diffusion AI engine, which is based off of stable diffusion, and then the model, and it runs through all that and spits out an image. I might do that 4 or 5 times and then pick one I like from the bunch. After that, I'll just run it through something called k-means color quantization. And that basically just takes, all right, what are the most common colors in this image? And it reduces it so it only uses those common colors, which is just, it's a nice way of making it look a little more pixel art oriented with limited colors and all that. As far as post-processing, that's really it. I don't like hand touch up the images I upload to social media. I feel like if I did that, it would be a little disingenuous of the capabilities of the tool.
Interesting. Um, I noticed also that you've been experimenting with the other aspects in terms of, for example, doing one-click photo to pixel art pipeline. Could you explain a little bit of what that entails as well?
Yeah, so that, I mean, the main goal there is to take an image that isn't pixel art and then make it into pixel art. The pipeline there is basically I take that initial image, excuse me, and I run it through clip interrogation. So the same kind of thing in the AI image generators that takes your text and converts it into like what it thinks an image would be that would represent that text. Clip interrogation does that in reverse. So it takes an image and converts it into text that it thinks relates to that image. So I run that on the initial image you have, and then I combine that text with the initial image, and then some other control parameters using something called control net, and then I tack on to the end pixel art style whatever, and I run it through my model, and it takes a little bit of finicking sometimes. It's getting closer. Most of the time it'll just spit out that image in a pixel art-ish style. If you give it more freedom, it'll look more like pixel art. If you give it less freedom, it'll look closer to the original image. So it's kind of a bit of a balancing act.
I see. I also noticed that since the last time we spoken as well, like you started to experiment with animating the assets that have been generated through that stable diffusion tool, and specifically, I'm seeing one that talks about a parallax background. Could you first of all explain what that is for the layperson, and second of all, explain the process of how you even put that together to create this illusion of motion that I'm seeing here in the tweet?
Yeah, totally. So a parallax background is this really cool concept that's been used in video games for a long time now. So basically, you get these different layers of an image and you kind of stack them on top of each other. So the further back they are, the slower they move, and the closer to, you or the camera or the player or whatever, the faster they move. So typically these are, done horizontally. You've probably seen some stuff like it if you played the game like Terraria or Starbound. That's what all the backgrounds in that's how those are made to kind of look realistic when they're moving around. And so the process for me making those backgrounds was there's a setting in retro diffusion called tile X, and it'll just tile an image horizontally. So the left side of the image and the right side of the image, if you put them next to each other, they just line up seamlessly. And so what I did was I generated, all right, give me some clouds. And I got some clouds and then some mountains and then some, trees and some grass. And these were all on, separate layers. And I cut them out individually. And then I just, once I had all those different layers of the parallax background, I just animated them separately. So the background moves a little bit and the foreground moves a little bit more. And that's how you get that illusion of depth.
I'm very impressed with, not only the quality of what I'm looking at, but also the fact that, if I didn't know any better, I would have just assumed that this was made by hand. And that speaks volume as to, what you've pulled off here. Very successful, you might add. That now you're essentially not only enable folks to, generate all sorts of assets that are static, but you're one of the pioneers in the video realm as well in terms of generating assets that can be used, say for Twitch overlays in Twitch, loading screens or live streams on YouTube, or even, for lack of a better term, B-roll footage, for, YouTubers that cover all sorts of stuff. I'm sure gamers more than likely would see a lot more value in this since, pixel art is very adjacent to gaming. But I think even in other fields, like I've seen some video essays on YouTube that actually leverage that pixel art aesthetic for informative purposes. So it's kind of like a step above infographics where, people leverage design for the sake of conveying information to now leveraging pixel art in a video graphic kind of fashion to cover certain topics and themes and things. I think it's pretty cool. And I'm pretty sure that by the time a YouTuber gets their hands on this, they'll be very excited. And as a matter of fact, I did speak with some folks in my circle who happen to be YouTubers, who usually make their own assets digitally by hand through, you know, software such as After Effects and so on and so forth. And the way their eyes widened when I mentioned that the thing could animate as well, um, that look, never gets old. Like it's almost as if you telling these people you've solved cancer somehow. No, but like jokes aside, though, yeah, like I think for me, this is what excites me about your tool and these tools in general is the fact that you are actually solving a problem. I think a lot of what puts you a notch above, your typical AI quote unquote project is the fact that you sought out to solve a problem in your own workflow pipeline, and that translated quite well because now that pipeline is made not only easier in terms of stitching ideas together as you described with the parallax process, but also even from a sketching purpose. I think a tool such as that gives you such an advantage that it almost seems unfair. And my question to you is, how you feel about people who will still use that against you as some sort of calling card to say that you're cheating somehow.
Yeah, I mean, my goal all along has been to to make tools that I find useful because I mean it's my job. Making art is my job. So if I can make that easier, of course I'm going to do that. And a big part of that is maintaining the level of quality as well as, making it faster. I don't want to make it faster and sacrifice, all the aesthetics for it because that's that's not going to help me either. But I mean, in response to people seeing it as some kind of cop out or, cheating in a way, I mean, it can feel like that, honestly, like when you're doing it. It's sometimes you just put in some words and you get something really cool out and you're like, oh, this is amazing. I don't, you don't really feel like you had much of a part in designing it. And as an artist, sacrificing that control it's a little weird. As far as it actually being something morally wrong or, you're taking advantage of this tool, people have been using technology to make their lives easier and, even in art creation to make creating art faster for literally forever. You got stuff like the paint bucket tool to fill in giant areas when you used to have to paint over them, right? Photoshop, you've got magic erasers and all that kind of stuff. Line tools. For pixel artists, a lot of us use like a dithering tool. So that'll just automatically add some textures for us. And all these things are, different ways of making your workflow faster, right? It takes a tedious exercise and streamlines it, makes it almost instant. So, I mean, AI tools, they're really just, taking that concept to the extreme. So instead of, oh, maybe, I would have to place all these different textures by hand, or I can, grab a stamp brush and select it, and then I can do it automatically. Now you're just saying, hey robot, make that texture. So it's really taking all of the shortcuts and optimizations that artists have built into their workflows for the past, few decades and making it a whole lot faster.
I see. Yeah, that makes sense. I feel like the consensus around, you know, design through AI, that conversation is now more than ever topical because of tools such as Firefly, which is an Adobe Copilot. Have you had the chance to try Firefly yet?
No, I haven't been able to play around with it. I've seen some stuff on it though. It looks pretty cool.
Okay, yeah, yeah. And the reason why I bring this up specifically is to sort of pivot a little bit back to one of the things I've mentioned, when I said that has any, startup company or any equivalent reached out to you to try and implement your tool into their pipeline. I think Adobe would be one of the contender in terms of um, taking a look at what you've done and seeing the value in doing that. And a bit of a curveball for you right there in terms of a question, but first of all, how do you feel about Adobe's practices in terms of how they disseminate their services to their customer base? And how would you feel about, them integrating your tool in some capacity within their, software shoot? And what I mean by that specifically is I'm sure what you've done is replicable in some capacity, that they could realistically have the manpower and the resources to train their own model to mirror exactly what you've done. And if they do so, how would you personally feel about this? Would you want to claim any credits? Would you want any sort of compensation in terms of advances you've made in that particular sphere, like, and so on and so forth?
I mean, in the end, well, firstly, Adobe's sales practices. I'm not a huge fan of subscription models in general. And I think Adobe really capitalizes on their pseudo monopoly in the art space to basically make their tools super, super expensive. Now, if you're using all of the Adobe tools, they're awesome. They work really well together. Like they're good tools. They're industry standard for a reason. I still think their subscription model is overpriced. um, if they built up some kind of a pixel art model similar or even better than what I have, I would be one of the first people to start using it. Right? I'm always looking for the best thing. I'd be a little bit bummed out, right? Because I have this neat project that I'm working on, and I really want to see it succeed. But if a company like Adobe came along and started doing it, obviously they're gonna get a lot more attention. I mean, I think honestly I could still have a fighting chance in a market like that, just because, um, it might be smaller, it might run slower, but in the end, it's not Adobe, and it's the model is trained on my work, and I hold it to a very, very high level of quality. And that's something that everyone who has my tool or has seen it work can attest to. Like it's very high quality, and I don't let back on that. Um, yeah, there have been a couple of attempts by pretty big companies to make these pixel art models. In fact, a team from Meta was hired by actually a game studio that I was working with a little bit ago, and it was this team of researchers from Meta trying to create a pixel art model for this game design company. And over the course of like 3 months, they couldn't do it. They couldn't get something that looked good enough to be used in the game. And the company ended up finding me, and I worked with them for a little bit, and we got something that was good for their engine. But you know, there's been some attempts by really talented and really smart people, and it's just not an easy thing to do.
And when you say it's not easy, could you specify what aspects you're talking about? Whether it's the training process, whether it's even the process of making or picking which data is used to be fed to the quote unquote algorithm of this tool.
Yeah, I mean that's exactly it. Picking the data and training the model, and specifically for pixel art has a lot of sort of rules. It has rules and it has techniques and it has different visual styles that are defined and consistent. And if you don't use those styles, it's a lot less clear. It's a lot less interesting, honestly. Um, and those have been developed over years and years while pixel art has been developing. And all of these things are super important because when you get down to something, at pixel sizes, it's really important to have defined shapes and defined objects. And colors really matter. So getting an AI model to, first of all, understand what pixels are and make sure that, it's not incorporating pixels of different sizes everywhere. That's one big step. But then getting it to understand concepts like dithering or limited colors, or understanding things like perfect line angles, outlining, subtle anti-aliasing, and all these different techniques that have been built up in the pixel art community. Unless you are a pixel artist and you're hand sorting or hand creating all this data, you're gonna end up just confusing the AI more. So it's a really difficult process on both sides, from a training perspective and from a data creation perspective.
I see. So now, would you say that in terms of, that process and the training it undergoes, when it comes to, these techniques that you're spoken about, in the pixel art community, I've seen a video recently, on TikTok that talks about the fact that actually the pixel art that we know today has very little to do with the pixel art of yesterday. And by yesterday, I mean specifically, the CRT era pixel art that we've seen on, games such as Sega or Super Nintendo SNES. And yeah, like because the whole incentive, at that time was to accommodate the pixels on the CRT screen, and now there's this weird Mandela-like effect that happens where what we remember these images to look like actually don't look like that when showcased on a traditional LCD slash 4K, monitor. So what's your take on that in like in terms of using that as like an input for training data?
Yeah, I mean, taking a look back at old video games, specifically from like, the Atari, the Game Boy era, and a little bit after that, they're a lot different than how people seem to kind of remember them. Um, yeah, and the pixel art style has evolved a lot since then, particularly in like the late '90s, early 2000s, when you were getting games coming out around then. It really started to shift from, all right, we're limited by the technology we have. We have to have this limited number of colors. We have to have these small sprites. And it shifted from being a requirement to being an option. And so people started seeing it as less of a restriction and more of an art form. And so that's really when pixel art started developing and people started making techniques for it. And, you saw people's styles emerging. Uh, even games like Doom, yes, it's a pixel art game, but they actually used photos of real world models for pretty much all of the monsters. A lot of the sprites were just photographs that were just downscaled and, reduced colors and all that. And so even then, the goal was realism. It was trying to, basically have a picture of something and put that in a video game. Versus later, when technology evolved and got more powerful, and now all of a sudden you can do 3D rendering and you can have realistic images and realistic models. Pixel art became a choice. It became an art form. And people started dedicating a lot of time into making it visually distinct and interesting beyond just nostalgia or, a limitation of the hardware.
I see, I see. So, to take it a notch above this idea that there are different eras and phases in the very pixel art movement, assuming in the scenario where we live in this, AGI era where, the tool is self-aware, for lack of a better term, how how would you think, like if you were to put yourself in the shoes of that tool, since a lot of it mirrors your own, art, obviously, how would you think it would go about improving its own, process in terms of refining, whether it's the art style or coming up with some other technique that perhaps have never been done before? And the reason why I say that is because if we are to think about, the training process very much like how it functions in the context of chess or, the game of Go, right? Notoriously in each of these examples where AI was pit against a human, not only the AI won, but the AI came up with, uh, sequences in the game that not only have it really been done before, but even if the best players were trying to come up with that, they would likely never will. So it's kind of putting into question, the limitation of the creativity that the human brain has. And I guess it's a little bit of a two question wrapped in one, but I guess number one being, how do you see that tool self-improve in that scenario, obviously, of the whole AGI self-aware stuff? But secondly, definitely speak about, like how you feel about your tool getting better than you in that strange scenario.
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately, if these tools are capable of self-improvement, they're gonna create new styles. They're gonna, like cubism, it basically wasn't a thing. And then all of a sudden, people just started representing things in abstract ways. And that became a really big deal. I think AI could be capable of doing that. And I mean, honestly, you've already started to see some of that with Midjourney, right? Because Midjourney kind of has, or at least it had in some of the older versions, its own sort of distinct visual style. And you could look at an image and go, oh, yeah, that's a Midjourney image, right? And so you're seeing these tools capable of creating unique styles that are identifiable. And I think that's what's going to start happening, honestly, at least in the art realm. As far as, my feelings about it getting better than me, cool. I've never really tried to be the best pixel artist, right? And that's not something that I would put on a high pedestal or look at and go, oh yeah, I'm the best. That's not important to me. What I enjoy is learning and creating things that I can be proud of. And so, if I'm the best, that's cool. If I'm not, oh well, I don't really care that much. And if something that I make becomes better than me, then I must have made it really well. So that's pretty neat.
That's, the more I speak to you and the more I look at your story, the more you strike me as someone who is very laissez-faire, right? That's the French term for let be. You're very laid back in that sense where you don't seem nearly as threatened or as panicked or even as concerned about the potential ramifications whatsoever. And some critics might say that, that can be a dangerous approach to have. But I think my counterpoint to these comments would be not on your behalf, just, from my personal vantage point as someone who doesn't even do pixel art and has no real incentive to do any of it. I do think that it's missing the picture here, which is, you're a working professional, obviously, and that I think part of that laissez-faire, attitude comes from the fact that as industry gigs go, like it becomes a grind at some point. So I think the tool has made, such an impact on your life that it's a no-brainer that you have this like chill attitude about it. Artists, on the other hand, they will very much feel strongly, and they still do to this day. Out of a interesting habit of mine, I would kind of come through your username by searching it up on the Twitter search bar and kind of like seeing what comes up. And yeah, people are still going on about you to this day.
Yeah, I know.
You're quite the celebrity, if I dare say. No, but like that being said, like my question really is trying to go for, why why are you so open-minded? Obviously, you are an industry professional. Obviously, that the tool helps you, but let's say you were not any of these things. You were not successful. You were the quote unquote average Joe, that was either starting out or has a platform of sorts to speak of, but no real reach really in terms of opportunities goes. Could you try and put yourself in that perspective and try and figure out how you would feel about it in that scenario?
Yeah, so a realization that I came to several years ago was that as an artist, I was never really selling my art, right? My drawings, my things that I created were never the valuable part of my process or my product. Companies didn't want to work with me solely because, oh, I made a nice picture, right? Lots of people can make nice pictures. In fact, lots of people can make a lot nicer pictures than I do. So trying to compete on that front is a losing battle, pretty much no matter who you are, because there's always going to be someone better, and there's always going to be someone better doing it for cheaper. So really, what I realized was that I needed to sell myself and my creativity and my ingenuity and my personality. So I moved away from, marketing my artwork as, oh, look at this cool thing I did. Look, I can make all of this really, really pretty art, and I could do this for your game, to, hey, I really like this project. I'm going to personally invest myself in this. I'm going to take your ideas, I'm going to make them my ideas, and I'll give you some cool art in the process. And that really became sort of not really like the upfront way that I sold my art, but that was how I thought about it. I wasn't selling art, I was working with people to create something that I enjoyed and that they enjoyed. And that's really when freelancing became a lot easier for me. And I actually started getting a lot more clients and a lot better paying jobs because I wasn't trying to compete with every other artist in the space selling their art. I was trying to compete with, you know, people who were promoting themselves. And that's a whole lot easier.
Interesting. Okay. Um, Having understood that, I think it makes so much more sense, when it comes to your attitude and really your outlook on things. You definitely don't strike me as the typical artist of Twitter. And I think part of that reason, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that you were not bred by social media the same way these younger folks have been, right? I think there's a little bit of an unspoken rule in the so-called art community, and even within the pixel art community, there's like the do's and don'ts that people tend to stick by for fear of perhaps um, being an outcast. Um, so it seems to me that from the jump, you never really were bothered by any of that, and that has freed you to make and take initiatives to the point where now you've quite literally transformed your life.
Yeah, I've never been dependent on social media, and I've made it a goal to avoid dependence on it. I mean, now I use it and I enjoy it, and it's helpful for promoting stuff. But if it disappeared tomorrow, ultimately, I don't think I'd be harmed that much. For me, it's always been more about personal connections and connecting with interesting people and people who have ideas. Because here's a little secret: people who have a lot of ideas and try a lot of stuff end up needing a lot of help along the way, and they're always going to need people. So if you make connections with, that guy who's always trying something new, eventually they'll probably call you up and be like, "Hey, I've got a new project. You want to work on it?" Right? And so forming these connections with innovators and entrepreneurs is so important.
Interesting. I so honestly, I think for me, like another thing that strikes me about you is that not only you have a very laid back attitude overall, but you also seem to, for lack of a better term, not all that invested when it comes to the broader context of the art culture. What I mean by that specifically is, like I think a lot of that ties into your attitude overall when it comes to social media and how you're not really looking at trends and trying to be part of that. You for one don't make fan art, and I would argue that that's a big part of being involved in the culture of any movement. So is there a specific reason as to why that is, like deeper down? Do you just I guess being a professional, do you just not have the time to really make fan art, or is it more of an issue of never really having engaged with that as a medium of expression, therefore that wasn't your thing, or like what's up?
I mean, as far as fan art goes, I actually have made some. On my portfolio, one of the first portraits I did was Cade 6 from Destiny, just because that character like really stood out to me, and I really enjoyed that game. A bit of a spoiler for for some of the story, although I'm not sure how they've retconned it at this point. But Cade 6 dies in one of the storylines, and that hit me, and so I just wanted to make a portrait of it, and so I did, and that was a few years ago now, I think. Um, yeah, I've made fan art of a couple of other characters here and there, but for the most part, I just I create things that come out of my own head, and it feels a lot more authentic doing that than it does recreating a character that someone else has already.
Okay, I see. Recently, speaking of what comes out of your own head, OpenAI has made a post where they featured a user who essentially made a short film animated through their tools by image generation, which then they then supplanted with other tools that would, bring into motion these characters. Um, in terms of, the pipeline of using the tool you've built alongside other toolkit, if you were to go about making a short film of some kind, when I say short film specifically, I mean anything between the length of, 5 minutes to 10 minutes, like if you were put in that a creative direction, hot seat, how would you go about it? How would you recommend for that person looking to leverage your tool in such a way to do that?
So right now, retro diffusion, it's not really built for animation. And that's more down to a limitation of the technology we have. Obviously, there's some ways to use AI for cool stuff like that. If I were to make some kind of short film, well, first off, pixel art is a terrible idea to do for something of that length, just because animation in pixel art takes a very long time. But if I were going to tackle that, I would probably start honestly with something like Blender, and I'd make some 3D models, and I'd get some kind of base template for animation from there, and then I'd probably use my AI tool retro diffusion to just get more inspiration, or maybe take some keyframes and generate characters for them, and then animate those characters by hand from there. Ultimately, it would come down to 3D rendering, because that's just the fastest and easiest way to make animations. Obviously, with a lot of refining on top and image generating and all that, but that would be the core of the process.
I see. Yeah, yeah. Because when I saw the parallax stuff, I mean, even if you were not to make a short film in the typical fashion, I'm pretty sure that someone could say, come up with something and, go around these restrictions. And a good example of that would be on YouTube. There's a channel that does depiction of films in a pixel art kind of context. So think like your classic beat 'em all or beat 'em up side scroller. They would actually depict these scenes in that pixel art rendition as a game basically. And I don't know, I personally find that appealing to look at and engaging. So I don't know, like what's your take in that kind of like way to do it?
Yeah, that's really cool. I mean, taking a movie and transferring it to a different kind of genre, I guess. That's a really interesting concept. I mean, you could probably take, something like Lord of the Rings and represent it as like maybe a side scroller, and a platformer, even like Mario or something, and just have this crazy journey through some video game levels, Frodo taking the ring to Mordor.
No, no, literally though. I mean, if you think of like iconic, like quote unquote scenes and the world of gaming, a lot of it traces back to pixel art. In Metroid, being is one of the biggest examples I can think of. Even though it's, not a something that's like meant to be engaged from that visual, spectacle fashion, you look at that and you still are, driven to see this narrative through and to figure out, does, do they make it? Does the protagonist win, and stuff like that. So I think in that format, someone who's clever and patient enough to, figure that out, they could put it off.
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, I think video games are the future of films. Because I mean, a video game is basically a movie where you're the character. You're the main character. You're performing the actions. And as things like dare I say, VR get better and better, you're going to have immersive movies, essentially. You know, it's going to be a game that you play with an entire cinematic storyline, just completely immersing you. And I think that's going to be just incredible when we can get to that point. Um, I really enjoy games like Hyper Light Drifter. There's no like text in it. There's no spoken language. All of the story is communicated through visuals and sound, and it's just a beautiful experience playing through the game and uncovering the secrets and learning the story as you go along just by interacting with the game world. And that's, you know, that's something that I'm always looking for in games is, you know, how they tell the story.
Yeah, I mean, without a doubt, JRPGs notoriously have always been the gold standard. I feel like we can all agree that Final Fantasy VII is popular for a reason, even though you're technically staring at a bunch of little characters, playing pretend to slice each other and all that stuff, it is still a engaging narrative and process. And I think the tool you introduce into the ecosystem, whether you like it or not, it's going to be part of a Kickstarter movement where people are going to be able to make these sort of things at that smaller scale way easier. And as the godfather of such a movement, how does that make you feel being someone who potentially might be the resulting kind of chain of events that leads to one of the biggest in latest, indie IPs to come out of the gaming space?
I mean, I certainly hope that um, that my tool will be used for some cool stuff, and I hope it inspires people and, you know, starts some kind of new movement. I'm a little doubtful it will, but I mean, if it does, I will be very happy.
Assuming you've been a little doubtful that you would even get any traction, and from based on your first conversation with me, yeah, again, that really ties back into your laissez-faire attitude. You don't. I think to actually reframe a little bit, it's not that you kind of let it be. It's just that you have no expectation, and that's something as an artist I've realized can be really hard to let go of. If you even manage to get to the point where you can get rid of that ego, whatever that even means, right? And I think that's cool that you're at that level. You're basically a Zen monk in the art world slash tech world, and you're kind of going on about your whimsical life and making art and just vibing. Like not a lot of people can speak to that comfort level.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, I try not to be entitled. Like, people don't owe me anything, right? I, if I make something for someone and we have agreed upon some kind of payment for it, then yeah, they owe me that payment. But if I just, you know, put stuff out into the world, I don't expect to get anything back. So that's how I see it. And making a tool like this, I don't expect people to love it. I don't expect it to be popular. I mean, I hope it is, and I hope it inspires people to make cool stuff. But at the end of the day, if it doesn't, I'm not going to be that upset.
LC. And that ties into one of my last questions for you, which is, I guess I'll start off first by saying, does the name King Jong-gi ring a bell to you at all?
I don't think so.
So, a little bit of a background. Kim Jong-gi is a Korean artist, most famously known for their um, handmade sketches. And truth be told, in my humble opinion, Kim Jong-gi is one of the most technically proficient artists out there, period. And it is a shame that unfortunately, as of last year, they've passed away. But what really got them a claim to fame, or if you will, mass appeal, was the fact that, and I'm pinning some of their work up top to the Jumbotrons for you to take a look at. Everything you're looking at, there's no pre-planning involved. This mad lad draws things basically like a machine, which is kind of weird to say, right? Because a lot of people actually say that about him, that whenever he draws something, there's no real sketching phase. There's no, you know, he doesn't erase all that often, if at all, to be honest. Most of what you see on his feed, it's all made not only, in that fashion, but it's made in one go from start to finish. So I'll start with that and say, what's your take on that in terms of like having someone mastering their skill to such a level where they're able to pull this off?
It's incredible. I mean, it takes so much skill and so much dedication to not just be able to create something like that, but to create something like that basically without interruption, without stopping and going back and fixing something, but to just kind of let it flow out of your head onto the paper.
No, which literally he does. And I found an actual video of him engaging in that drawing process. And I don't know when you'll be able to see it, but you quite literally see him draw what he's drawing as if it was already there, as if it's just filling in these blanks on the page, which I'd argue AI sort of does the same thing at its current stage, right? Where um, all it really is doing at the end of the day is filling in these blanks that you, the user, tell it to. Now, the only difference is it's going to take, what typically takes Kim Jong-un anywhere between a few minutes, since he's a master, to, a few months for like some of his biggest pieces. Now you're gonna have these tools be able to achieve that same thing in mere seconds, depending on, what rig you got going on. And my question to you has to deal with, the controversy that surrounds Kim Jong-il as a artist. In the wake of his passing, someone made the decision to train an AI model based off of what he does. And I'm assuming, I'm only speaking from my vantage point here, they were hoping to create that sense of, continuous flow in the drawing. But the only result that they've got was that it was honestly at best a poor imitation of Kim Jong-il's, mastery, and at worst, quite an insult. And don't take my word for it. If you search Kim Jong-il's username with anything along the lines of AI art, you'll see quite the flurry of tweets, essentially dog piling on the guy who came up with the tool. And they doubled down by not only making the tool available for free, but they actually did, like if I recall correctly, a V2 of that tool. Um, so what's your take on that in terms of, I feel like both you and this individual, are no stranger to controversy, but there are differences in my opinion. For one, you involved more in the pixel art side, and for two, what you've built is more so suited in the context of, a software, I would say a copilot, a tool, right? That doesn't, that it does generate the art for you, obviously, but I think it's more meant to serve as uh, a foundation, to for you, the artist, to build off of. So, what's your take on this whole situation with Kim Jong Il, knowing what you know now about them and their life, and this whole thing, and what's your take on AI, being and bad PR in this particular context?
Yeah, so this kind of thing is actually something that I've gotten into a lot of arguments with people in the AI space over. Taking an individual artist's work and using that to fine tune a model to try and replicate that work. Um, I think, you know, at best, at absolute best case, it's plagiarism. You've taken that person's ideas and that person's style and their process and stolen them, essentially. From a technical perspective, it's probably something closer to inspiration or mimicry, but morally and ideologically, I think it's basically theft. Now, that's different from a generalized model. A generalized model takes a whole lot of different people and a whole lot of different people's works and kind of mashes them all together and stirs them up and creates something new. And I think that's fine. You can take, well, there's a principle in art. If you take inspiration from a lot of people, then your work is original because it's a combination, it's something new. If you take inspiration just from one person's artwork, it's derivative. It's a thing created based on that work alone, and it's considered wrong. It's considered theft. And so that's always been a big deal for me, is when these people who aren't artists and don't understand the etiquette involved think that they can just take a style and that's fine. I think at bare minimum, you should respect the requests of an individual to not create something like that based off of their work or based off of their style. And if you want to do it, you should ask and get permission. I mean, for example, my tool is literally trained off of my work. And so it replicates my style. In fact, a few of the quirks of it, the artifacts that it has, are because of some of the technique that I use when I create images. And so you can see a lot of my work reflected in the things that my tool creates. In the same vein, that goes for other artists. If you train something on their work, it's going to reflect some aspect of their style. And in the end, although it might not be legally defined, someone's work does belong to them. Now, you could, find a whole bunch of images in a style by a bunch of different people, and the style might be pretty similar, right? And I think that training on that visual quality isn't necessarily a problem. But if you just grab a whole bunch of images by someone like Kim Jong-gi and then smash them all into a data set and put it into an AI, you basically just stolen from that one person. And, that's not cool, and that's not okay. Again, legally, I don't think there's really any problem there, but morally, you're in some dark gray, black area there.
Right. And to sort of further illustrate my point, currently in the film industry, there are conversations being had about AI being leveraged as a way to uh, replace a performer after their death. And most famously, that discussion became quite topical in Star Wars when the lady that plays Princess Leia passed on during filming, and they still made the decision to have them in the movie as a 3D made asset, right? And now actors such as James Earl Jones, most famously known for their voicing of Darth Vader, amongst other things, have personally signed on to be used in such a way, post death, right? And I think at the end of the day, it does come down to choice, and it does come down to understanding, like what it is you're building the tool for starters. I think it's very easy to see who is trying to ride off the coattails of someone else's fame, if you will, versus someone who's trying to actually build something that has use cases. And a good example of that would be VTubers. And VTubers are very related to this concept of having an asset doing the work for you, meaning that instead of having to, animate and having to do a lot of these things, what you're starting to see, especially on social media, like TikTok and Instagram, artists actually are using the VTubers that they've personally designed to serve as an advertisement for their tool, for their not only tools, as in what they use to draw the model with, but also their services as freelancers, because quite a lot of them actually offer rigging services and so on and so forth. So there's that whole debate around where does really theft occur, when it comes to uh, that model or that person's likeness being used? Is it when it's done in poor taste, or is it more in the sense of when it's done flat out? That's personally not for me to decide, and I don't think you're equipped as well to answer that question and in a very black and white kind of way. And that's the point, right? Like, I think a lot of these issues are very gray. And as you said, morally, there's a lot to take into account here. But I think, not to make this like take a dark turn, but we all know how corporations function, right? Their whole pejorative, their whole what motivates a corporation is profit. And in that pipeline somewhere, it's not unlikely that you'll start to see things emerge where they're just a mere puppet, or puppeteering of someone else's work that then gets, at best, no credit, and at worst, no compensation. And if that's the case, I don't think that industry is going to last very long. What would be your take in that kind of scenario?
Yeah, I mean, companies like Disney have always operated like that, and they're not going to stop anytime soon. There's thousands, probably tens of thousands of nameless animators and illustrators that you will never hear of and have never heard of that have created some of the most incredible and beautiful and famous things, in pop culture. Um, and that's just kind of sadly how this corporation art pipeline goes, right? The art makes them money, and so they hire artists to make the art. Um, as far as like the whole bringing people back from the dead for movies things go, it's always been honestly really creepy to me. Um, like digitally recreating someone for the sake of nostalgia is weird. Like if you tried to do that with a loved one who passed away, you'd need to go to therapy because you'd have problems. Um, and I don't see that as any different for movies, honestly. Um, yeah, there's just something really weird about the line that companies will cross um, to get some kind of emotional trigger out of an audience. And it's really disturbing.
I'll take it a step further and mention that, another AI tool I was looking forward to bring to your attention that has been around actually way before this whole AI hype took over the mainstream. So there's this company known as Replica, Replrka. We all know where this is going. But for the people listening, either in the space or after the fact, the way I understand this whole story to be, um, Replica became a company and due to someone's death, someone's passing, right? And actually NPR, which has a section of a podcast known as Invisibilia, does cover this, where they've talked about how the tool was made, to what drove the incentive, to how it even evolved later on as it caught the interest of Silicon Valley. So yeah, we personally, when I first heard about that, I was very skeptical, and that was in the height of the pandemic. I remember That's when I first found out about this tool. But the tool itself came out even way prior to that. I think it was 2017 or 2018, something along those lines. But Replica was this being sold as a chatbot who would speak in the likeness of someone that you know who have passed on. That was kind of like the whole motive behind it, because that's literally how it was built. Because of the friends passing, they come through their chats, their messages, their comments, their social media profiles, you name it, and they fed everything to that AI, and that became the skeleton, if you will, of that particular software. And when that company went public, immediately I started to see some red flags on my end personally. For one, the replica as it exists today is way different from the replica that I was told about in that NPR coverage. For one, it's not just a mere chatbot anymore. It's a think of it as like a VTuber meets a chatbot, where you get to talk to a virtual character and you get to make friends with it. You get to, vent to it. You also get to date it. And a lot of the advertisement I've seen about Replica specifically leans heavy on the dating aspect. They're targeting, quite frankly, folks that are lonely, folks that may be inept in terms of their social ability to, engage with human beings. And that's where my question is leading to, like, how do you feel about AI being leveraged in such a way, number one? And number two, how do you see AI being supplemented with this idea of not just the art that you consume, but the art being able to engage with you, right? I think someone can make the case that, again, this is a theoretical scenario where, the AI tool that you've built becomes at that AGI phase, and it can become quote unquote self-aware and talk back to you and all these things. So having a pretty neat pixel art generator that can take its own different forms and become basically your own little Pokemon, right? Kind of like that evolution of the Tamagotchi, where it does more than just live in your little pocket. It actually can do things and evolve and change forms and stuff like that. So that's really the two angles of my question to you in that particular replica situation.
Yeah, Replica from its creation was designed to prey on people in emotional distress. Originally that was when you lost a loved one and you wanted to keep talking to them, which is a natural desire, right? That when faced with loss, you want what you lost back. And Replica fed that unhealthy cycle, that illusion that that person was still there when they were gone. And the real solution to that problem was grieving and moving on. And now it's turned into preying on people who are in a different kind of emotional distress, people who are lonely, people who feel like maybe no one loves them or no one will love them. And so they turn to this chatbot for some false sense of love, when in reality it's just code. It's just a machine. And I think it's cool to have conversations with an AI. Like, that's neat. That's a feat of technological wonder, that a machine can talk to you like a human can. But at the end of the day, it's a machine. And maybe not everyone here or not everyone listening, agrees with the concept of a soul, but people, in my opinion, in my worldview, have souls. And that's part of what makes them valuable and what separates them from machines. So when you're talking to a person, it's an entirely different thing from talking to a machine. And having some kind of, honestly, I think it can be as closely described to an addiction. Having an addiction talking to this chatbot is sad.
Yeah, and the second angle I was pitching to you was this idea that, um, I think someone who's smarter and quite frankly more resourced than you are probably would think of a way to come up with, Pokemon 3.0, right? This idea that, hey, like, not only it can generate just about any sort of Pokemon lookalike you want or whatever monster that you want, but the monster can talk to you and do all these things and do this other stuff, like, do you see it going that way where, not Pokemon the company specifically, because I'm doubtful that they're gonna go that route, but like the concept of, you know, interactive um entertainment has always been a thing with gaming, but now with AI thrown into the picture where you get to generate your own assets that could in theory be made into its own separate little mini game. What's your take on this whole thing? How do you see this going, and how do you see specifically your tool perhaps in some capacity aiding in that kind of realm?
Yeah, I think one of the coolest things I've seen so far was a VR game that, and I can't remember the name of it, so I'll put a link later. Um, but it's this VR game that it's told as this story of the main character, you, and your interaction with this robot that's part of this ship, this station that where the story takes place. And this secondary character, the robot, is AI driven. And so that leads to a lot of different interactions because you can just ask it any questions. You can just talk to it. And as the story progresses, their reactions change, their responses change, and it flows with the story and drives the narrative. And so, that leaves the game really open-ended, where you can do a whole lot of stuff and you can have a whole lot of different conversations, and it's very immersive. And I think having NPCs driven by AI is going to be a really, really popular thing. That's always been one of the big criticisms of games is the NPCs are lifeless. The characters you interact with feel rigid and static. They'll always give you the same or a similar response, and it never changes. But now with AI, you can have whole personalities infused into these characters. And in fact, the really difficult part is actually reining them back in and making sure that they, adhere to the storyline of the game. And I think you'll have similar stuff in the visual space. So you'll have characters driven by AI, and their appearance will be driven by AI. And so you'll get, maybe one day they'll be wearing, a set of armor, and then the next day there's some kind of formal event, and they'll be in formal clothing, or they'll want to change to do something else, or they'll look a little different depending on what's happened to them. And driving all of that with AI image tools means that you can have basically any scenario happen, and it'll be able to respond to that dynamically in real time, and you can interact with it. Like, you could ask an NPC, hey, can you change your armor? Or, hey, go equip a sword, and they'll just do it. and you might not even have to create the assets for that. So a player could come up with any scenario they can think of, and it can happen in the game. And that would just be incredible. And I really hope that tools like mine will be used to do innovative and creative things that make games a more tailored experience to the players, and more immersive and more interesting. I mean, some of my favorite games have always been the ones where, you can create whatever you want. Things like Minecraft and Terraria, where you can just build whatever you imagine.
So the last thing I got for you is also a curveball, and that would be piracy. Um, your tool, in revenge, based on the tweets I've seen, your tool has been made available for free to people to download and to use. What's your take on that, first of all? And second of all, in this realm that, it's no longer theoretical, right? It used to be that people would engage in this discourse that at some point it's only a matter of time before it's no longer the art that is sold, but the model trained off of the artist that gets sold. And you're a shining example of that. So, how does piracy apply in a scenario like this, in your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I haven't seen any of the piracy. I mean, whatever tweets you're mentioning, I haven't found them. So, I mean, again, it kind of goes back to I don't really care a whole lot. I'm doing fine. People are still buying the genuine thing and still interested in what I'm doing. And at the end of the day, I plan to keep improving it. So, whatever.
Yeah, spoken like a true as if a kind of person. But, this idea that copyright and art are so intertwined, um, you know, if you were, to say you were to be on a board of, judges and you were to evaluate, what is a copy, what is original when it comes to a discourse between, the theft of so-called someone else's model. And Kim Jong-il is a good example of that, right? Let's say that, you know, currently the tool that they've built off of this stuff, it's pretty bad, but it stands to reason that it could improve and get as good, if not better, of what the original maker wanted, on the original maker have been doing. So like in that scenario, and even in yourself, when it comes to how you do things, how do you see that play out in the courts?
Yeah, I mean, legally, I don't think there's a whole lot that an artist can do if a model's been trained on their style. I mean, from the ground up, a style isn't even copyrightable. Only individual works are. So if you can prove that the model will recreate those copyrighted images of yours very frequently, you might have a case. But I think really the only way of combating that kind of thing will be either if the law changes or through some other means.
When you say some other means, like what do you mean specifically?
Well, I mean, you can always just like ask people to take them down. If that doesn't work, um, you have legal options like DMCAs and that kind of stuff. A lot of platforms, if something is suspected to be um, infringing on copyright, usually they'll just take it down to be safe. So a lot of that can be used for these models. Specifically, if you're an artist that has had a model trained off of your work, you can question like the use of that work, like how did they get it, how did they use it, um, and it hasn't been decided yet, to my knowledge, if using copyrighted works in training an AI model is violating copyright. So that's something that kind of remains to be seen in the courts.
Yeah, this whole situation overall is tricky. When you look at the fact that it is both a copyrights issue, but it's also a software issue because now these worlds are not only intertwined, but they're nearly indistinguishable at this point. Um, because the whole and it sort of ties back into your own tool and how, as I understand it, Stable Diffusion is open source, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's not a whole lot there that locks it in terms of a legal aspect. Because once it's open source, anyone can do as they please with it. So I think when it comes to, the potential fallout of a legal battle, they're covered. And people can feel how they want to feel about that specifically. But I do think that the legal aspect for America specifically definitely remains to be seen. And I think it moves way too slow compared to the crazy pace at which these things move. I am hoping though that policymakers and folks involved at that more, political level when it comes to making decisions actually see these tools for what they actually are and not just what they're advertised to be, whether it's by the media or even by their own makers, because, it's very similar to the whole TikTok situation right now and how it's being currently in talk of being banned. But what they're not telling you is that they're actually going for more than that. They're going for VPN, they're going for peer-to-peer networks such as torrenting, and to a certain capacity, that also includes blockchain. So, you know, that's a tricky situation where we can't afford to make any mistakes because that will have long-lasting consequences for decades to come, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, the legal system is always a mess. People trying to use it for their own ends instead of to benefit humanity.
Well, that remains to be seen. And until then, I for one look forward to use the tool that you've made. I still very much enjoy it. I still very much like what you've proposed in the art movement. I think it's pretty cool that, you tend to have a more, besides a laissez-faire approach, a more level-headed approach, which is definitely refreshing when it comes to these conversations. And part of the mission here, that started, with even before Whispel was, made as a concept when I first spoken to you, was because of the fact that the nuance was needed. I really do think that we're not gonna make sense of this without nuance, and we can't get nuance without conversations. Because now people can truly see where you're coming from and context, not just through a series of tweets that may or may not depict, how you truly feel about things. And more importantly, you're not under the pressure of having thousands, trying to dogpile on you, coming at you.
Yeah, there's a whole lot of a whole lot of people arguing in a whole lot of different places, and most of the time, neither of them know what they're talking about.
Yeah. And that is the sad part, So I'm hoping, I for one, I'm hoping that, through our interactions and through, you gracefully giving us your time to explain, not only what your tool does, but how it functions and, your personal narrative and how you came up with it. I do think that it would be an additional step in the right direction in helping people making better sense of these tools. So I can't thank you enough for, doing that and really coming up and being open and transparent about everything from, how much it's made you to even, like how you personally feel about a lot of these issues, because some people I've noticed have very reserved opinions that they don't want to make public for fear of shame or whatever else, man. So what you're doing is very, in the face of increasingly dogmatic thinking, what you're doing is very brave. So I can't applaud that enough.
Oh, well, thank you. I mean, I've tried to never really let popular opinion affect my own opinion, and so that kind of just extends to social media, I guess. I don't something I mentioned in the previous article. I have a lot of people in my real life, my social life who care about me and give me drive to do what I do. And so I don't need the approval of people online. Um, and so that's kind of afforded me to be in this position where I can just say what I think and not worry about the repercussions.
Well, that's quite the note to end on. Rely on your people in real life. Go outside and touch grass. Um, thank you again, Astropulse, for coming on to Whiz, sharing, your insights, wisdom, and yeah. Uh, if you want to plug anything before we head out, you're more than welcome to do so. Whether it's upcoming projects or, call to actions to check out something you got going on, like let us know.
Yeah, I mean, I'll throw a couple links your way um, once I leave the space here. But other than that, I've got retro diffusion. I'm always making it better. Constantly trying to improve there. Got a couple of other projects sort of behind the scenes in an adjacent space. Um, yeah, I guess just keep an eye on my Twitter for all the latest news on what I'm doing.
Yep, no doubt, no doubt. All right. On that note, this was Astro Pulse, speaking about AI art, pixel art, and all these other fancy things that come with these topics. We'll catch you on the next one. See you, folks.
See ya.